In this practice problem, we're going to look at how changes in the determinants of supply and demand affect the market. Specifically, in this question, we're looking at the market for bacon. The first question reads, resulting from a large campaign from Richard Simmons, there is a new wave of healthy low-fat diets. How would this influence the market for bacon? The first step to answering this question is simply to draw our axes. So let's just pick out our axes here. We can draw them. We have price on the y-axis and quantity on the x-axis. Then we can draw our demand. So a nice downward sloping line for demand follows the law of demand. And then we have an upward positive sloped line for our supply function. So let's label each of these, D for demand and S for supply. We can label our equilibrium. So we'll label that E for equilibrium, and we'll put a 1 subscript on it since we're probably going to be dealing with a few equilibriums here. We can go down to our axis to see what our equilibrium quantity is, and then go horizontally. So we'll call this P1 star and this Q1 star, so we can remember to keep track of which is our first and second and third equilibrium. So let's look at this first question. We know there's this new wave of healthy eating, and one of the determinants of demand is going to be taste. So now the taste for this bacon is going down since bacon is relatively unhealthy for you. So now we're going to see this for every price, there's going to be a reduction in the quantity demanded at that price, which means we're going to have a shift to the left of the whole demand curve. So let's draw that. So we're going to have this shift to the left of our demand curve. So we'll call that D1 for the second demand curve. And now we're noticing that for every price level, we have a reduction in the quantity demanded. Now to figure out what our new equilibrium is, we just have to look for where our new demand curve and the old supply curve intersect, which is going to be this point. We're going to label it E2 now. We can go down and we can go Q2, sorry, Q star 2 subscript, and we can figure out our equilibrium price, so P star and then a 2 subscript. And so we can notice two things right away. The price fell, as well as the quantity fell. So to complete our answer to this question, let's scroll down a bit, and let's write a sentence summing up our results. So this new wave of healthy eating causes the demand for bacon to decrease. This results in a fall in the equilibrium price and quantity in the bacon market. So now that we solved part A of this question, let's move on to part B. The second question reads, in addition to this new wave of healthy eating, a drought decimates the pig population, and to show/discuss the new equilibrium in the bacon market from the combined forces of the drought and the new diet. So the combined forces. So we need to have both these changes in one graph and then see how it changed, how the equilibrium changed from the first equilibrium we saw at E1. So what I've done is I've kind of cleaned up the graph we had. I've redrawn it so we just get one supply and one demand curve, and we can start by first looking at the Richard Simmons health campaign like we did in the last problem, and then we'll look at what happens when we have this drought that's decimating the pig population, and we'll look at their combined effects and see what we can conclude. So the first thing we'll do is just kind of write in what we found in part A. So we saw that this new healthy diet campaign by Richard Simmons is going to decrease the demand for bacon. Okay, so let's look at really what's happening in Part B. So in Part B, we see there's a drought that's decimating the pig population. This is going to really reduce the number of producers in the market. And we know the number of producers is one of the, the key determinants of supply. And so with less producers, that means the total supply in the market, so the supply curve in the market, will start to shift to the left. So for every price, they're willing to supply less bacon. So our equilibrium from these combined forces is going to be where our new demand curve and a new supply curve intercept, which is going to be at this point here. We can again go down to our quantity axis, and now we see, Q star, let's put 2, and we'll put E2 up here. And then maybe just below the P star here, we have the P star 2. So just looking at our graph, we'd be really tempted to conclude that, these combined forces are going to cause a decrease, in the equilibrium quantity down here and a decrease in the equilibrium price over here. But before we, jump to that conclusion, let's take a closer look at how this decrease in supply and decrease in demand are going to affect market equilibrium. So let's start by looking how this decrease in supply and decrease in demand affect quantity in equilibrium. So what kind of pressure they put? Do they put downward pressure on quantity or upward pressure on quantity? We'll do the same analysis for prices, and we'll see kind of what we conclude. Okay, so let's just scroll it down a little bit to give us some more room. We don't really need the graph for this. This is, mostly theoretical. So let's look at demand. So there's a decrease in demand. There's a decrease in supply. We can first look at, the effect on equilibrium quantity and the effect about equilibrium price. And then, well, let's be consistent here, let's put a P star then. And what we'll do is we'll see if we can conclude anything about the total effect by looking at whether these, demand and supply affect quantity in the same direction, as well as whether, demand and supply decreases in each of them affect price in the same direction. So let's start by quantity. Okay, so we saw in the graph, we can see that this decrease in demand is going to cause downward pressure on quantity. So we know this is downward pressure. Now we can look at the supply curve if we want up here, and we can see that this decrease in supply, so this upward and leftward shift of the supply curve, is also causing downward pressure on quantity. So they're both causing downward pressure on quantity in equilibrium. So we know that the total effect here, so let's put the total effect down here, is going to be a decrease in Q star. Now let's do the same for price. Okay, so looking at demand, we see a decrease in demand is going to cause a downward pressure in prices. So if we just looked at E1 and looked at the effect of just this change in demand, so this decrease in demand, we saw this in the last video as well, that's going to cause a decrease in price. So there's going to be downward pressure on prices from this decrease in demand. So we can see this, as we have this decrease in supply, this is causing upward pressure on prices. So if we scroll down, it's causing upward pressure on prices. So now the demand, this decrease in demand, is causing downward pressure on prices, but the decrease in supply is causing upward pressure on prices. So the key thing here is we don't really know what's happening to P star. It's going to really depend on which one is bigger, whether the decrease in demand is bigger than the decrease in supply. And that's going to determine whether the equilibrium price goes up or down, or whether it stays the same if they're equal. So let's write a quick concluding sentence. The combined forces of the diet and drought will cause equilibrium quantity to go down However, the influence on price depends on the magnitude of these changes. That depends on the magnitude of the supply and demand shifts. Perfect. So what this question is really supposed to illustrate is that, while the effect of one of these changes could be really obvious in terms of a change in demand or supply, we really have to take a second and think about it when there's all these forces happening. And this is much closer to what's really happening in the world. We have all these different forces that are, changing our supply and demand at any given moment. And so we really have to think about how the magnitude of these changes really affect the prices that we see in the market.